Welcome back to the Personal Experience Podcast. My name is Jules Scott, and this week's episode of the show is discussing anti-Semitism and living as a Jewish person in America. And I have a guest with me today, a dear friend of mine who can talk about this topic from his own personal experiences, and his name is Kalani. Welcome to the show, my friend.
Hello there.
Is this our first time doing a show together?
Not quite. We did a bonus episode of Torn Think Tank a very, very long time ago.
I can't even remember. So yeah, okay, it's been a long time.
You had me play piano on stream.
Okay, yes. So it was like a entertainment episode, but it wasn't an actual like let's talk about life episode.
Right.
Now, Kalani and I have a long friendship. We met each other in World of Warcraft. I was trying to think of the date, the year, and I think it was 2008. Does that sound right?
Sounds about right. It was during Burning Crusade.
Yes. We met each other from other people who were putting together groups for raiding. It was my very first time getting together in a raid group, and Kalani was the tank. And I think... I mean, I know for me, it was specifically like we got to know each other, but one of the things that really kind of bonded us together was the fact that we realized that both of us were Jewish. I think that was a big bonding point for us.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to talk a whole lot about that, but let's first start with you and to introduce you. And I'm actually going to have you do it about who you are, where you live, and what you do.
So I'm Kalani. As she said, currently living in Atlanta. Lived here for 24 years now.
Gosh, has it been that long?
It's been that long. I was born and lived for the first 10 years of my life in Detroit.
Okay.
So it's definitely been a shift going from the north to living in the deep south. Things are different down here.
Yeah, for sure. And so I definitely want to dig into that specifically. So, I mean, you said your first 10 years were in Detroit.
That's correct.
In your background of growing up Jewish, let me say specifically, like when you were growing up, what percentage do you think of your peers at school were Jewish versus not Jewish?
Not that many. To contrast, when I was in Michigan, when I was young, my parents did put me into private school.
Mm-hmm.
I can think of, it wasn't a big class. Class sizes weren't that big. It was maybe 40, 50 in my grade.
Okay.
And I can think of maybe 2 or 3 others who were Jewish.
Same thing for me. I grew up in a very strongly Catholic town. Like we had a Catholic school, and it was a grade school through high school Catholic school, and then the public school system. I think I could have counted in my grade. I was like one of 3 total Jewish kids in my grade.
Yep.
We had a bit
more. Yeah, there were a bit more here in Georgia. Mainly due to the area of the suburb of Atlanta that I grew up in. My class size there in high school was much larger. We were a graduating class of around 600.
Wow.
Yep. So obviously there were significantly more. I was close friends with 5 or 6, but there were at least 15, 20 of us who I knew to be Jewish, and there were probably more who I weren't aware of,
Yeah. So how much time did you spend going to Hebrew school?
So again, growing up as a kid, every Sunday. Yeah. Every Sunday I went to Hebrew school. In the summers, I went to a Jewish summer camp for a month every summer. So it was definitely a part of, my experience growing up. Made it a lot easier to know who was and who wasn't, since those who were, especially with Sunday school, I would see them on Sunday, and then I would see them at school, public school on Monday.
Right. I have went through the whole Hebrew school Sunday program as well, and I will tell you, I don't know about you, but oh my God, I hated it. I
It
hated
wasn't the
it.
most engaging.
Mainly for me, I remember growing up, and it was the other kids in my class were just so horrible that it made it a really tough experience because a lot of the teachers there were volunteers
Yep.
and they just didn't have a lot of ability to teach grade school children and keep them disciplined. I can remember a time where I don't know why I had it, but I had like a tape recorder, like a small boom box that I had brought to Hebrew school where I could actually record what was going on. And the tape I had were like, I mean, it was disgusting. It was like the kids were making
Ooh.
sexual jokes to each other. And like, I'm like, this is what Hebrew school sounds like, mom and dad. Like, I was like the beat reporter to explain to them why I hated it so much.
It wasn't that bad. It's interesting to think about it now because throughout public school, through grade school, I got by relatively safely. I never had to really deal with bullies or any of that. The only time I had to deal with bullies was Sunday school.
Really?
Yep.
Okay. So, did you want to talk a little bit about what happened?
Honestly, I never knew why. He needed someone to pick on, and he chose me.
Yeah. And so the bullying wasn't related to religion. It was just
No,
straight up bullying.
it was just straight up bullying. He was looking for someone to take out his anger on,
Hmm.
and I was a vocal target.
I think the first time that I ever experienced, so I remember being in grade school, in public school, and feeling other, but in the beginning, it was almost actually kind of cool because my background is that my mom's side of the family is Catholic and my dad's side of the family is Jewish, and both of them were raised that way. And my parents marrying was a huge scandal. It was pretty bad for, because my mom's parents didn't want her to marry a Jewish man and they did it anyway. They eloped and eventually everybody came around and everyone was fine. And but then I got to celebrate two of the holidays. I got to have Christmas at my mom's family and Hanukkah at our family. So to me, so like to my peers, I was actually pretty cool because I got to do
You
all of
got
these
you got
different things.
presents twice.
I got presents twice, so I was actually pretty cool. But I always had that feeling of like being other, because people would talk about Christmas at their house or things like that, and it would be tough. It would be interesting because they would be like, well, why don't you have that? And I said, well, no, we do the menorah lighting and we have the 8 days. And they go, oh, you get 8 days of presents. And I'm like, yeah, no, you don't. Like, I don't know if you did, but
We did, but it was 1 or 2 days of good presents, the big stuff.
yep.
And then, it was, a little box of Ferrero Rochers or whatever.
Yeah, or you
It,
get the gelts or something like
yeah.
that. The horrible
Yeah.
tasting metallic gelt.
Hmm.
The chocolate covered. So basically, it was chocolate coins wrapped in this gold paper that made it all taste like metal. So gross. If
It
you've
tastes
never,
like aluminum.
oh,
Yeah.
so bad. But I
Because
remember. Go ahead.
most of that chocolate had been sitting around for a while, and
Right,
it
it's
it
always
had
aged.
bleached all the metal. Yeah.
So tell me about your feelings and like that feeling of just being other, not necessarily being called out for being Jewish, but just feeling other.
We're kind of fortunate. It's we have passing privilege. You know, we can fit in, and we are only seen as other if we choose to.
Right.
But that there's always that nagging thought at the back of your head of what if they knew?
Yes.
How would they respond? You're always asking yourself that question. How would they respond if they knew? Is it safe to let them know?
Yeah.
Um, because I learned very quickly here in the South that it's not always safe to let people know.
Did something
Um,
happen specifically to you or something?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So let's talk about it.
While I said that you know, the interesting part was that I never had problems from my peers. Now, granted, again, I grew up in a fairly nice suburb of Atlanta. Um, the student population was actually fairly diverse.
Hmm.
There were plenty of other people who would be considered other, so being other wasn't that problematic with the student body.
Hmm.
It was teachers that I ran into issue with.
Really?
Absolutely. And again, moving to the South, I learned very quickly, be careful about who you reveal your otherness to.
Hmm.
Um, the first time I really ran into it was eighth grade. Um, seventh grade, I had an amazing. They called it Target, but it was the honors program.
Okay.
Um, amazing teacher, seventh grade, who got me because we moved to the South when I was in sixth grade. Seventh grade, they put me into the honors program because of this one teacher who brought me into it. And then the following year in eighth grade, the honors teacher did not like me. Not only was I Jewish, I was also from the North. I was a carpetbagger.
Mm.
Um, she actually had the audacity to call me a dirty Jew in front of the other students.
Oh my gosh.
And as things were, you take that to the school administrators, they're just going to kind of brush it under the rug. They don't want the scandal. They don't want the controversy. They don't want the trouble. It's just kids acting out.
Well, and
Kids
it's a
making things up.
It's an eighth grader's word against a teacher.
Exactly. A teacher who had been teaching there for 20, 30 years.
Like you had no chance.
Absolutely none.
Did that happen more than once?
Uh, Not to that extreme. That was probably the worst of it. But there were always little things that came up. Another example was in college, that we had a composition course where we were reading a book about. It was a story about a girl who had discovered Plato's writings and was learning a lot from it.
Mm-hmm.
And the professor thought it was appropriate that to have the class write a paper, write an assignment on what Christian values could be seen in Plato's writings.
Mm-hmm.
What Christian values did Plato talk about? And me, being who I am, stood up and effectively argued that it was kind of the other way around, that Christianity had adopted some of the writings of Plato
Mm-hmm.
on account of chronology, time. Plato existed a couple hundred years before Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
That viewpoint was not welcome in that classroom, and I was instructed to leave and not return.
What?
And to withdraw from that class, or I would be given a failing grade.
That's insane.
Yes, it was.
Oh my gosh.
But the lessons I had learned was, okay, I withdrew from his class, and thankfully it was early enough in the semester that I was able to enroll in a different professor's course.
Yeah.
Without issue.
How did these experiences affect you?
I mean, as I said, you learn to be careful. You learn to be very careful about how you reveal who you really are.
Mm-hmm.
And you learn to wear that mask, that you blend in. You're just like everyone else until someone gives you that hint that, okay, maybe they'll be accepting of you being that other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And my experience of direct, discrimination happened also in eighth grade. It could have been seventh, but I think it was eighth. I'm trying to remember. But the experience happened, I was in the school play. And there was a part that I had to play. So we were doing a 50s old TV show review kind of thing. So Happy Days and all these kinds of different musical things that they put together to make this musical. And they cast me in the role of Mrs. Cunningham. from Happy Days.
Okay.
And my scene partner was for Mr. Cunningham. The direction was that I was supposed to be sitting in this chair watching the kids dance, and then Mr. Cunningham was supposed to come up behind me and put his arms on my shoulders, or hands on my shoulders, and I was supposed to reach up and put my hands in his. When we like sway to the music together. That was the direction that we were given. And the boy that was cast as Mr. Cunningham said that he didn't want to do that. And they asked why, and he said, because she's Jewish. And I'll never forget that feeling for the rest of my life. It was like,
Yep.
You don't want to touch me because I'm Jewish? I literally just couldn't comprehend it, number one. And number two, like, that is the worst possible feeling you can feel, of just being completely like shunned for doing nothing wrong.
Absolutely.
For just existing. And exactly the same thing. It was never a secret in my school that I was Jewish in grade school. But when I went to college, it was the same exact thing that you described, which is that you needed to be careful about who you revealed your otherness to. And then on the other side of it is when you did find those people who were Jewish, you felt like there was this instant kinship that you just understood each other no matter what.
Yep.
Because you all knew you went through the same things in different contexts and different experiences, but you did. Like, you all went through the same thing. And it becomes this connection that is like hard to not, like, you can't explain it as easily to other people who don't know.
Absolutely. So for me, I was always kind of raised with an understanding, like, even before I experienced it myself. A lot of that came from my mother, because she was the daughter of two Holocaust survivors. Her parents were both born in Poland. Her mother specifically survived 3 years in Auschwitz.
Incredible.
So when they came to America, they moved to the Detroit area after the war and had to rebuild their lives. They had nothing. But, my grandmother always had that tattoo on her arm, her prisoner number. And it was kind of always a reminder, of these things that happened. It was kind of an interesting question that my mother asked me one time is, do you consider yourself an American Jew or a Jewish American? It's a subtle difference, but there's a difference. Because for her parents, they considered themselves Polish.
Yes.
They were Jewish, but they were Polish. That was their country. Only to find when they, were liberated from the camps, they were literally people without a country. Their citizenship had been revoked. They couldn't be deported because there was no country to deport them to. And they had to figure out who would accept them, who would take them, who would take these people who don't have a country to go home to.
Right.
And it leaves the question of not necessarily where your loyalties lie, but where does your identity lie?
I don't know if I've ever really found that personally. Have you?
Not really, because it's both. Absolutely, I'm Jewish. And, we can talk about what that means as well. But, I was born here. I was born in Detroit. I am American.
Right.
And the question becomes of what does that mean?
Right.
What does it mean to be an American, and what is our part in shaping what being American means?
Yes. Especially for, when you think about the percentage of Jewish people that live in America. I was doing a lot of reading for this episode prior to, and one of the statistics that I saw is that it's approximately, I think it's approximately 4% in America.
4% of Americans are Jewish?
Are Jewish, yeah.
Sounds about right.
And so when you think about how much of a minority that is, and then when you also think about, I was doing some research on the Anti-Defamation League's website about the rise in anti-Semitic speech. And and hate crimes related to anti-Semitism in the U.S. And they said that on their website, they said that a report released in May 2018 analyzing anti-Semitic speech on Twitter provided the first ever snapshot of the trends and themes of anti-Semitism on the social media platform. Among the findings, at least 4.2 million anti-Semitic tweets were shared or reshared on Twitter over a 12-month period.
I absolutely believe it.
And you do, and we do, and we know it because even this past year, my parents were telling me about how in where they live in New Jersey, which is more, there's a heavier population of Jewish people on the East Coast, especially around New York and New Jersey, that even there were people who had to make sure that they didn't have menorahs or candles in their windows to identify their homes as Jewish for fear of being targeted and having people come, there were reports of break-ins, vandalism, assault, people getting accosted outside their homes. It's just it is, and you're talking about 4% of the population who actually exist in the United States as Jewish. And so I'm still I'm 46 years old and I'm still trying to wrap my head around the fact of people that can hate me for just what the religion that I'm raised in.
Yep. I mean, that's all there is to say to it. Some people just need someone to hate.
Yeah. And so can we talk about so at this point in your life, you're in your 30s now. How do you, what do you consider your the extent of your life being in religion?
So I was much more religious when I was younger.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, I went to a conservative summer camp every year for a month.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of it was so focused around ritual, praying 3 times a day, saying certain things, praying before meals, so on and so forth. And it kind of raised the question in my mind of, what does this actually mean?
Right.
Is there actually meaning behind these words I'm saying? Obviously they have meaning, but do they have meaning to me?
Mm-hmm.
Or am I just going through the motions?
Mm-hmm.
And as time went on, I gradually became less religious.
Mm-hmm.
Now, at the same time, I think part of being Jewish is there's a cultural aspect to it as well. And that I've probably have embraced more than I used to, especially now that I'm living on my own. It's, you raise the question, what become your traditions? What becomes the culture of your home?
Right.
And a lot of those aspects that, I've just kind of adopted from my parents, from my grandparents, and, they're a connection to your past, to your family.
It's 100% true. And I think that connection is even more strong when you know for your family what they had been through to get here.
Absolutely. Just to kind of touch back on, especially with my grandmother, I think I've told you the story of how, I went to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C.
I was hoping you'd bring this up because I was going to ask you about it.
Yep. My grandmother never spoke about her time during the war, about her time in the camps. She spoke about it once, and that was to a researcher at the University of Michigan. After that, she refused to ever speak about it until the day she passed. And we had a lot of unanswered questions. Thankfully, it was about, I think, 7 or 8 years ago that a lot of the records that the Nazi government kept, because they were meticulous in their record keeping, but a lot of those records were kept sealed out of concern for, privacy for the victims. Those records were unsealed a couple of years ago and were made available. Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Israel, was given a copy of those records. The Auschwitz Museum, in Poland, was given a copy of those. And then the memorial, the Holocaust Memorial Museum in D.C. has a copy of those.
Mm-hmm.
So during that visit, I went up to the, survivors and descendants kind of library that they have, and I spoke to the gentleman who was working there. And I said to him, we know my grandmother was in Auschwitz. We don't know a whole lot about her, about her history during the war and, time in the camps. So I gave him my grandmother's name. Thankfully, all of this has been digitized, so they weren't filing through paper copies.
Mm-hmm.
But he looked her up, and he found. I walked out of there with about a stack of paper about an inch thick, just copies and printouts of all the various records about her. We didn't know that she had been in there for 3 years. That was a fact that we found out then. The fact that they tried to emigrate to, when she met my grandfather, tried to emigrate to what is today, what was then Palestine and is now Israel, and were declined. They were not allowed to go there.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually, they got married. We got a color copy of their marriage certificate, and eventually, they emigrated to the States, and that's kind of where that paper trail ended. And we would have to chase that, what came after that with, the U.S. Immigration Service,
right,
and get records from them. But just all of the things that I remember about her, all the things that my mother remembers about her parents, the cultural things even as small as, what do you call the hand towels in your kitchen?
Mm-hmm.
People call them a towel or a rag. In my house, they're a shmata. Literally the Yiddish word for rag, but it's a shmata. Little bits of Yiddish here and there. Those are the pieces of culture that we hang on to.
Yeah.
The recipes, the challah recipe, my grandmother's challah recipe. That smell that I would come downstairs to as a kid to my mother make, baking bread.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the pieces that I've kind of held on to more than the religious rituals.
Right. Yeah, and just the memories of those things that got passed along to you from your family. It's kind of the same thing for me too. It's interesting because it's hard for me to talk about this, but I will for this podcast. I hope that it is not interpreted in the wrong way, but so I went through the whole system of being bat mitzvahed. I went through the whole Hebrew Bible, the study of the Torah and all of the, like you got to stand up in front of everybody and read your portions.
Yep. I had Rosh Hashanah weekend.
On yours?
For my bar mitzvah, yes.
Jeez, mine was in May. It was like May 20, because my birthday's in July.
Yep.
So yeah, went through the whole thing, had the big party, all those things. And my parents were pretty much the high holy day, going to synagogue type of parents. But our synagogue was actually a conservative, was like a conservative rabbi. And if you don't know, in Judaism, there are actually, like, if you want to put them into buckets, there's like 3 buckets of intensity, I guess, if you want to.
That's a good way of putting it.
So there's Orthodox, which is the, that's the stuff that's like, you're living, breathing it. That's your life. Conservative, which is the middle ground, and Reform, which is the more radical, little more liberal in terms of how they manage and do their rituals. So the temple that we it was like we didn't have a lot of choices in our area. Yeah. And the conservative temple was the only one. I don't know if that was the same thing for you too.
More or less.
Yeah. And so we would go, and they knew that most people were kind of the high holy day visitors, which would be Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, which are pretty much a week and a half apart from each other. And that's when they would get the most people coming to services. And my mother actually did convert to Judaism when I was young, and my sister and I went through the process with her. So I don't really know even what we were born as, but we were put into a pool, and I guess in the word baptized, I don't even know what the word is anymore, but it was like a baptism in the way to convert to Judaism. And So we would go to these services every high holy days. And my mother hated the fact that what would happen is because the synagogue knew that everybody was there during that time is when they did their fundraising. And the way that our synagogue did the fundraising is that they would have a big, during like the most intensive part of Yom Kippur, which is when you are fasting for 24 hours to repent for the sins of the year. They would have like almost like an auction type of thing for fundraising where they would announce every family of how much they donated and call them out by name. And
That's interesting.
My mother hated it so much that she would take my sister and I out with her because we were too young to stay by ourselves. And I just saw how angry she was, and I didn't understand why. I didn't know why she was so angry. But she was angry because she felt that it was highly inappropriate what was happening. And as I got older, I actually saw it for myself for finally. I just knew that there was a bunch of hubbub going on and a bunch of people's names being like people standing up everywhere and coming up on stage and being hands shaken at by the synagogue president and whatever it was. And when I finally realized why this was like what was happening and why I was so disgusted and so like, this is not religion. This is not honoring the tradition. It was a money grub. And I just started to I lost my faith at that point. And my parents were, my dad specifically was very disappointed. I think I continued to go to synagogue for him even when I went to college for like the first year. And then I just said, Dad, I can't do it anymore. And I pretty much just said, I'm agnostic. I just said, I don't really have a religion. But interestingly enough, like my dad, of course, he lights a candle. So as an honor for the dead, for those who have passed, there's something called a Yortzeit candle that is lit every year on the anniversary of a person's death. And my father still does that for every person in the family who has passed. And he goes to synagogue on the high holy days. He still does. But has kind of honored the fact that I don't have an adherence to the religion anymore. Like, he's kind of accepted it. But though he'd like me to like wish him Happy New Year on Rosh Hashanah still. But this past Christmas, I went home to visit my family, my mom's side of the family, and my grandmother had died this past year. It was the first year without her. And I don't know who did, but my mom had brought a menorah, because it actually Christmas and Hanukkah fell on the same week last year. And I think it was for my niece, who was 4 at the time. And we were actually educating people about the menorah and saying the prayers of Hanukkah in front of my Catholic family. It was pretty cool.
Yeah.
And I felt that tradition, like you were talking about, like the things that we were teaching, like my cousins and my niece. And it kind of came back to me, like I could remember all the prayers, even though I hadn't said them in probably 20 years. But I don't know, I still have those horrible kind of like, this is not religion feelings about what happened to me. But at the same time, I have a fierce alliance with anyone who identifies themselves to me as Jewish because I know who they are. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I mean, like I said, that kind of comes back to the cultural aspect.
Right.
You know, like my father was raised Orthodox, whereas my mother was basically raised not Jewish at all,
Mm-hmm.
not religious at all. Again, because of her parents' experience, they were very hesitant of letting anyone know that they were Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
While at the same time, when they emigrated, they went to Oak Park, Michigan, which is where they lived in an apartment block that was entirely Jewish.
Right.
Because of the very thing you're talking about. Because they have that bond, that mutual understanding of your history and of your otherness.
And they know what you've been through.
Yep. And I think, I think that's part of why we hold on to it. But I think it's also part, I mean, we kind of have a responsibility
Hmm.
to tell those stories. There are people out there who would say that never happened. Those people never existed, right?
And it's actually coming very close to the time when those people who could tell those stories are no longer going to be here to tell them.
Most of them aren't.
And most of them are not. And, I mean, I've thought of that a million times, of
Hmm.
especially in the world of America that we live in now, where there are, like, I mean, the revisionist history that happens right now. I mean, people who just basically just deny that things have happened, even though there are millions of accounts of what happened in the history books and people in the Holocaust museums. And I mean, we're still doing that awareness and story sharing now, like you said.
Yep. And again, it's kind of the very premise that you talked about in the first episode of the show. For the people who don't experience it, it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
It's easy for them to say it doesn't exist because they personally haven't seen it. And coming back to what we said, what I said earlier about, are we Jewish Americans or are we American Jews? That's kind of, again, that's part of our responsibility.
Right.
There's the poem Martin Niemöller.
Hmm.
You familiar with that one?
I think
That
so.
at first they came for you know the communists, and I said nothing because I wasn't a communist, so on and so forth.
Yes.
And when they came for me, there was no one left to speak.
Hmm.
That when we say, the common phrase when we talk about the Holocaust is never again, but we have to realize it's not just for us. It's not just to speak up when there's anti-Semitism. It's injustice of any kind.
Right. And so then we see what has happened in the mainstream media. People really became aware of this when Nick Cannon came on his own show with some really, really painful and hurtful remarks about Jews and his understanding of Jews versus Black people. In a world today where we are
Yeah.
literally all chanting Black Lives Matter and trying to stand up for the rights and against the injustices. And I don't know. The first thing I thought of is I would think that someone who is Black would already understand what it is like for someone who is Jewish.
Absolutely. And I mean, again, personal stories about that. Um, when my grandparents emigrated, again, my mother's parents, they worked for a time in a luggage factory to earn money.
Mm-hmm.
But when they were able to, they opened their own kosher butcher shop. But while they lived in Oak Park, the only place they were able to open the shop was in neighboring Royal Oak,
Mm-hmm.
which was a predominantly Black neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
I know, a kosher butcher shop in a Black neighborhood, but the people there knew them. They knew that my grandfather was a quiet, gentle man who just wanted to live a peaceful life with his wife and three daughters. And they knew what the horrors they had escaped. But if you think about it, that was in the 60s in Detroit.
Yeah.
That was when the race riots started.
Yeah.
And many, many, many white owned businesses were burned to the ground.
Mm-hmm.
And my mother always tells the story that they stood there and they watched, terrified that their shop would be, that was their livelihood.
Right.
But my mother would tell the story of how they watched a group, a group of rioters that were going down the street, and they came to the front of their store, and they approached the front of the store, knowing who owned it.
Yeah.
They spray painted the windows and then left. And when they went to go read what had been written, "Soul brother, do not burn."
Wow.
Because they knew my grandparents' history.
Right.
They knew that they had escaped the same type of hatred and bigotry that they were protesting against.
Right. And just imagine if the world spent more time getting to know each other from that level,
Mm-hmm.
which is exactly why we're doing the show right now.
Exactly.
It is the purpose and the lifeblood of exactly why this show exists in the first place. Because I don't understand. And it just is such a struggle. And like, I don't ever want anyone to feel like they have this otherism that we have felt, that a person of color has felt, anyone who is not in the majority has felt. The truth is that it's going to exist. It's just kind of it. I don't know if it can ever go away fully, of just separation of tribes, because that is really the core of who we are.
It is.
You know,
And like, I'm not sure that the otherness should ever go away. You know, there's always the pieces that set us apart, that make us different, that makes us see things in different ways.
right.
And there's strength to be found in that. But what we have to try and get rid of is that fear, is that concern of, what if they know I'm different?
Right.
That,
And the acceptance
where
of
we
being
want,
different.
right, where we want to be is where we're enthusiastic about sharing those,
Yes.
where other people are accepting of it and saying, oh, you have a different point of view. What can I learn from that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we do see some of that.
You do. And that's what kind of keeps me going in a lot of ways. And you could take it down to the level of being, you like this team versus I like this team. Or in gaming terms, you're a part of this guild and I'm a part of that guild. And and healthy rivalries are fun and silly, and you can be goofy about it and shake hands at the end. But
absolutely.
And those things are fun and constructive, and you do learn things from each other. You and I are probably like some of the most different personality types out there. We're so different from each other. And yet the reason why our friendship works so well is because I learn from you and you learn from me. And
right. We've
done that for, 13, 14 years. Knowing that we are so different from each other. Because I am the emotional, crazy creature, and you are the logical, everything is logicked out to the end. and
everything has its place.
It does. And we have the potential to infuriate each other because of how different we are. And, but one of the things that's been very cool for me is that I can identify anyone who's like your personality type instantly and be like, I get you. Because I have spent a lot of time with someone who is just like you. And, that to me is the amazing thing that I want to see in the world, and for trying to identify and to not fear the unknown, because that to me is probably the biggest thing. Like, that kid who didn't want to touch my shoulders because I was Jewish was afraid of what exactly? That teacher that told you that you were a dirty Jew was afraid of what exactly?
Afraid of what they don't know.
Yeah.
And don't want to understand.
Right. Or to try to understand how those words and those actions affect other people. Because you remember that story, I remember my story. It's never going to leave us. We're going to take that to our dying days. Those things have impact and they have memory. And so that is something that I want people to understand. Even now today, I was reading an article, not to bring up a whole lot of pop culture crap, but the whole recent stuff going on about Kanye West and how he is, he's been going on what they would call Twitter rants and, kind of weird public appearances. And then his wife comes on, Kim Kardashian comes on to Instagram and says, please have empathy and consideration for my husband. He has bipolar disorder. And this is a mental health episode, and please have compassion. And I personally was like, you know what? I don't like him. I don't like her. I have these emotional feelings about it. But at the same time, like, I totally understand if he's having a manic episode, this is not his fault. This is mental health. But we fear what we don't understand, and then we redirect it by saying, that guy's fucking crazy. That guy's like, he's off his rocker. Like, somebody better put him in a home or something. Like,
Right.
and because we don't understand, therefore we fear it. And I don't know if I'll ever process the fact that someone could fear me because of the religion that my parents raised me as.
Yeah, it's fear of the unknown. It's also fear of change.
Mm-hmm.
The whole bit about shifting demographics of the country, what was the reports that said, whites will no longer be the majority in America by 2028 or something like that.
Yeah, that's 8 years from now.
Yep. That's scary for some people.
A lot of people. And
to them, we represent that change.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot easier to lash out at a person than an idea.
Yes.
It's a lot more. There's a physical representation of it.
Mm-hmm.
It's easier to target.
Yes. And what I hope, knowing and hearing this podcast and listening to it, if you know Kalani and you didn't know he was Jewish, that your understanding of it is that you're not going to go, ugh, or that you've heard my story and said, well, I didn't know that about you, in a way that's negative. I hope that it actually opens your eyes and says, I didn't know that about you, and I find that really interesting, and I want to know more. I want to understand more.
Yeah, I mean, it goes the other direction. That to them we represent that change, but at the same time, I mean, how many people have you spoken to over your life that when they found out you were Jewish, they said to you, "Oh, I've never known a Jewish person. You're the first Jewish person they've met."
A lot.
And
Yeah.
How many strange questions have you gotten about being Jewish?
So many.
Have you been asked where your horns are?
No, I've never been asked that.
I've been asked that a few times.
Really?
Yeah, especially down here in the South.
Good Lord.
Because they hear these stories and there's no one to prove them wrong.
Yeah, mainly my questions are, do you eat pork?
That's a more reasonable question.
It's like, do you eat pork? I don't know. I think there's also their impression of that we are all like, we must marry a Jewish person. Like it's our parents' designated thing that we must marry someone who is also Jewish, or we don't, then oh, you didn't marry a Jewish person. Dating too, that was another thing of checking of is that person Jewish or not.
Yep.
But oh my gosh, I did not know about the horn thing in the South, and that kind of scares the crap out of me.
Yeah, I mean, again, especially people who live in more rural areas, they've never met a Jew, their parents have never met a Jew, generations back, they've never had the experience of meeting someone that they knew was Jewish.
And so they have heard all the perpetuated stereotypes, all
those stories.
Money grubbing, uptight, Jewish guilt, some of that's true. But but the and that was why it was hard for me to tell the story of my kind of falling out with the religion, because the money grubbing stereotype is a big one.
Yeah. And
that wasn't, to me, it wasn't like, oh my gosh, my religion is a stereotype. It was, this is not honoring the things that are what I feel is important, in terms of how they should be honoring a holiday. And so I just decided to step out. But the whole thing about it is that there was not any choice for me. Like, you went to a really conservative camp.
Yep.
I had to go to a conservative synagogue. Had there been a reform situation, I might have had a lot of different experience, but they weren't available in where we were. It's sad. So, I mean, at this point now, I look at it and say, I want to talk about this, which is why I'm so grateful that you came to talk to me about it today. And to hopefully open some eyes about the experiences that people have every day and still have every day. And that you and I both will fully admit that we will always shelter ourselves from whether or not we reveal our background to someone if we don't feel it's safe.
Yeah.
I hope that changes someday.
Me too.
Is there anything? So we've been going for almost an hour.
Yes, we have.
Is there anything that you wanted to touch on before we close this out?
I think that's all I've got.
We've covered a lot, and I thank
We
you
have.
so much for being so candid and so open about your experiences and your family's experiences.
It was my pleasure.
Thank you, Kalani. And if there is there a way that people can reach out to you, get in touch with you if they would like to?
Best way to find me would be on Twitter at Keyboard Kalani.
He is a piano player, by the way, which
I
is why
am.
the keyboard. Kalani, thank you so much for doing this with me. It was a pleasure, and I will talk to you soon.
I will talk to you soon.
And that will do it for another episode of the Personal Experience Podcast. If you would like to nominate or suggest a guest or suggest a topic that you'd like me to cover, you can reach me and the show in a few ways. You can reach me by email at personalexperiencepodcast@gmail.com. You can tweet me at JulesRPG, or you can tweet the show at its home at PersonalEXP Show. This show is available on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, Pocket Cast, iHeartRadio, and Direct Feed, also available on YouTube. Thank you for listening to the Personal Experience Podcast. Seek understanding. Feel empathy. Connect to one another. I'll see you next time.